welcome Year 12 of 2021, the class that can survive absolutely anything. All right, textual conversations. We know that this is a really tough module, guys, and we're there to support you in any way we can. We're getting stuck into revision this morning, and what we want to do is remind you of the importance of going back to the rubric. You've got it. This is a conceptual module, and apart from knowing your two texts as a whole, whether it be Plath's poetry and Hughes' poetry, Campion's film and Keats' poetry, you've got to have a sense of them as a whole, but you've also got to understand the principles of the concept, and you're going to find that in the rubric. The other thing that's imperative, guys, that you've got to do at home on your own is get that stopwatch happening on your phone and practice writing answers to questions in 40 minutes. You've got to do it again, do it again. Doesn't matter if you fail in your first few attempts, shred them, throw them in the bin, do what you've got to do. But you will get better at it. You don't want the first time you're writing about this to be in the actual exam. All right, first thing we need to ask is, what actually is a textual conversation? Well, look, goodness, guys, I'm trying to have a one-sided conversation with you now. You're not there to answer me. That's not a literal conversation. It's much more of a metaphoric concept. So what we're doing is we're looking at how an original text was picked up by somebody at a later stage for whatever purpose. For Hughes, he had complex reasons why he wanted to re-engage with Plath's aerial collection. For Campion, it was a very different purpose in wanting to re-engage with Keats's poetry. But we need to be very mindful of who each of those composers is, what their world was, what was shaping their personal, social and historical context when they were actually engaging with that original text. I'm not going to read the rubric out to you. You're able to do that for yourselves. Now, if you're having trouble with the notion of any of the terms of the rubric or the notion of what a textual conversation is, I've put up a link there on your screen, and that'll also be contained in the attachment that goes with this. Have a look at it because it's quite worthwhile. What we now need to do, though, is move on to the question. You don't know what your question's going to be. We don't know what your question's going to be. Where will the exam committee have found the terms of the question? In the rubric. That's where you've got to go. That's why you've got to have thought about it very deeply. You've got to process that rubric and process it in terms of the conversation between your two texts. All right, now, when responding to the specific exam question, I put this in your Marcus report after you did your Mod A trial, but please remember that when you're looking at a HSC exam paper, above each question, there is the 3 dot points that tell you what they're assessing you on. And I want to point out to you that dot point 1 is always about the question. Dot point 2, I want you to notice there the importance of that word evaluate. You are evaluating the relationships between the texts and the context. Now, that is a loaded dot point, guys. That is asking you not only for analysis from your two different texts with, the similes, the metaphors, the personification, the camera angles, whatever it be. It's actually asking you to evaluate the relationship between that first text and either the original text and the latter text, considering, note the other word there, the composer's context as well. So how did Hughes's retrospective stance influence his choice of writing in relation to Plath? How did Campion's postmodern, post-feminist film influence her discussion of the original romantic notions in Keats's poetry? All right. Again, you can read what's contained on the rest of that slide, but it is really important. The markers are looking for you to use some of this language. They want to see if the latter composer has used intertextual references, if they have reimagined or reframed, they need that language there. Also, think about each of these as a representation. What did each of the newer texts, so Hughes and Campion, what did they include? What did they leave out? What did they emphasize? What did they borrow? What did they copy, discard, amplify, perhaps mock? And think about what that brings to the conversation. All right, now, what you need to do, again, I've already given you a lot of work to do. You're going back to the rubric. You're going back to your whole texts. Even guys looking at poems you may not think you're going to write about, you still need to go back and read them. You still need to be mindful of it because you never know how you may end up just recalling some aspect of it. Okay, think very clearly about what the purpose and context of both your composers actually is. Do not, when you are writing about their context, please don't go whacking in whole sentences or paragraphs on their context and purpose. You're attaching that to it might be a phrase that you're just working into your discussion of that poem or that particular literary reference, whatever it be. Okay, the next thing. We also do not want you to be writing chunks of irrelevant or generalized material. You've only got 40 minutes. That means if I say that you're writing a balanced response, that means you've got roughly 20 minutes on each of these huge texts. For Plath and Hughes, you've got 12 poems there, guys. How are you going to honestly show that you understand that? Well, that's where you've got to be discerning. You've got to make wise choices in your preparation. Likewise, Keats and Campion. Which poems are you going to look at? What do they capture? Make sure they capture different things about your composer. Same with Campion, different aspects of the film to capture different layers of her purpose. Make sure, by the way, when you're going back and you're doing your 40-minute examples, one of the things that you could actually do when you finished writing an essay without sending it to your teacher is actually do the highlighter method. Get your highlighters out. How much have I written on my original text? How much have I written on my latter text? Because you'll be surprised, more often than not, students concentrate on the one they like the best or the one they find the easiest to write about. And if your essay is imbalanced, then that's going to work against you because it's in the marking criteria. Markers are looking for relative balance, roughly 50-50 on each of your composers. And note the other thing that I've got in the blue writing there, guys. Your essay, I'm going back to that dot point again, must have evaluative components. You are showing an understanding not of who was right or what was the best text, but evaluative in terms of the nature of the textual conversation. Now, I'm just wondering if any of my guests want to add anything at this particular moment. No? They're both looking at me to say, yep, Mrs. Millen, you're just all over it.
Absolutely.
You've said it all.
Yeah. All right, so let's keep going. I'm sure you've got questions. You can write them down and send the questions to us as your teachers. All right, now, I'm looking at Campion first. Sorry to privilege Campion and Keats first, but all right. We need really strong statements. Now, I've got here Campion's homage or respect for Keats was informed by, now I've got 3 different ways I can identify her context. One is postmodern, one is feminist, we can even say post-feminist, or I can talk about the new historicist. All of this stuff is in your notes, guys. You don't need these seminars to reteach you the material. You've got the notes there, you just need to go back to them. But again, using the correct language to identify that specific aspect of their context is imperative to doing well here. So let me go back again. Campion's homage or respect for Keats was informed by, I wouldn't put all of these in, I'd pick one of them, a postmodern or a feminist or a new historicist perspective, and uses cinematic form as opposed to poetry to deliver an innovative original text that reimagines Keats' romantic poetry for us, for you, for us in the 21st century. Now, what do Plath and Hughes, if I go to that module now, recognise the complexity and humanity expressed in Hughes's poems. Unfortunately, in the trial, a lot of students were a little bit too simplistic in trying to only consider Hughes's poetry as being a defence of himself. What you needed to do, guys, was spread that out and look at the fact that when he wrote these in the late 20th century, an awful lot of attitude shifting, value changing had occurred since Plath wrote her poetry. Yes, she was a voice for the feminist movement in so many ways. Yes, she wrote against that patriarchal dominance and that oppressive weight that she experienced as a writer and as a woman. But Hughes is, remember, writing after the feminist movement and in response to the scathing attacks from many of the quite militant feminists. Now, I've got two Hughes experts sitting with me at the moment. Would either of you, I shouldn't say Hughes only, Hughes and Plath.
Well, there's one thing I'll say here, and this comes from Ivy Alvarez, and it's one of the things that we looked at during class, or in my classes anyway, that the intertextual or the textual conversation that happens is that dialogue that began when the poets met and continued after Plath's death. And as Alvarez says here, often a dialogue is signalled when a poem by each writer shares the same title. On other occasions, however, it could be a shared biological event that's re-envisioned separately by Plath and Hughes the latter, of course.
So Miss Murphy, when you say biological, you're talking about
biographical. Did I say biological?
But you're talking about something physical, something real, like a moment, an experience that they shared. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. And he's, of course, re-envisaging her poetry. So, as it says, looking at the titles, sometimes you can sort of see that textual conversation. But what you have to do is go back to the poetry itself. Remember the title of the module. It's textual conversations. It's not he said, she said. It's what the poetry says.
Yes.
The only thing you can rely upon here is the poetry. The biographical stuff is contextual, but it's not everything.
Yeah. Did you want to add anything?
I also think you've given a major insight into understanding what Hughes is doing in birthday letters by referring to the fact that he called the whole set of poems, I forget how many poems there were, Mrs. Murphy, can you remember?
Yeah,
70 or so?
Yeah, 70 to 80.
That he called them letters, and famously is recorded as saying that he started writing them on her birthday to just because on birthdays we normally think of these people that have been so important in our lives and are no longer part of our lives.
Yeah.
So he wanted to continue that conversation
and
that keep
the relationship happening.
Yep.
Am I also right in saying that the fact that he chose to use the second person you and adopt that confessional style was also, I spoke a moment ago about Campion paying homage to Keats. Isn't he in a way paying homage to, like, showing respect to her and her writing style?
And it's a direct address as well.
Yes, a direct address, and it is, as you say, a homage in the sense that he is acknowledging that she is an extraordinary poet.
Yeah.
And that the voice that she, developed through her poetic voice, which, we refer to as confessional poetry because she was really laying bare for the first time someone had done it in such a raw and real way. And he, in some ways, is adopting, without being entirely confessional, we largely refer to his style of poetry as autobiographical, not quite confessional. But it's obvious that she has influenced the fact he never wrote poetry like that before.
Yeah. So in some way she drove the conversation.
Absolutely.
She ignited the conversation.
Absolutely.
But the direct address too becomes very intimate, and it's like we're invited into their intimate space.
Yes.
Yeah. And you feel that when you're reading them.
Yeah.
All right. I think that, what we're getting here, the difference between an average essay and a good essay is acknowledging these complexities. They're not simply saying Hughes wrote them to defend himself.
No.
That's far too simplistic.
No.
So we need to be very mindful of that, guys. So as we just said, being as specific as you can possibly be, not writing lots of words, but using your language wisely to acknowledge that Hughes had a complex context and a range of purposes, not one singular purpose, that he was as much about paying homage to Plath and her brilliance as a writer, living in such difficult times, as well as recognizing that he himself had lived through that feminist movement responses to the Ariel collection. We could say the same about Campion's context. You know, we're looking here not in terms of decades, but we're thinking here in terms of centuries.
200 years,
and in those 2 centuries. So again, guys, recognizing, I'm just going to move on to the next slide, but recognizing that Keats was writing in an era where the world was going through a great deal of rapid change, you know, post-industrial revolution, but it was still a very male world, that patriarchal world, that patriarchal context. And as much as Keats's thinking and Keats's writing showed an understanding beyond patriarchal limitations, his poetry itself can only ever offer that singular male gaze, that singular male response. Do you want to speak to that, Mrs. Sayers? I was thinking that with some of the poems like La Belle, and even the way he wrote to Eve of St. Agnes, there is a complexity there that he's actually starting to recognise. And even in the in Bright Star itself, that reference to intimate, passionate experience, that whole idea of the place of a woman beyond simply being a muse.
Yes. And the object of the male gaze.
Yeah.
And the woman as the femme fatale, as in La Belle Dame Sans Merci, who lures men into situations beyond male control, and can bring about their ultimate destruction.
Yeah, and so what does Campion do? Campion reconnects with that. Again, Campion herself a feminist, Campion herself living in a postmodern, post-feminist world, looking at the world, recognising those limitations on Keats, but trying to help us to understand it more powerfully. How? By giving us the film through Fanny Braun's perspective.
Yes, and how she shifts the perspective from the male perspective of seeing their world to the female perspective.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think in many ways she was replicating some of the difficulties she as an artist had in the male-dominated world of Hollywood film, where women, you know, she was one of the very, very first women directors to be acknowledged as being one of the best directors of her era. She had to fight that sort of prejudice against women. And the way that I read what she does in the film is that she's telling the story through the female eyes.
So
and from
if
the
I
female
look
perspective in the story. So to me, it's more about the love story.
Yeah.
And she actually incorporates, includes the poems as part of the love narrative of the story between
and
Fanny
that's her
Braun.
homage too.
Absolutely.
And so when I look at this boring list in front of me, ideas and concerns, the human condition, mortality or permanence, look, goodness gracious, guys, they're boring words. But if we take into account everything that's just been said, and I think, okay, what did Campion want me to do? She wanted me to feel more powerfully what Keats is trying to say. If I'm getting it from Fanny's perspective, I understand the human condition so much more because I understand what Keats and Fanny had to lose. I understand the importance of the moment, the power that he captures in the beautiful imagery, whether I'm talking about Ode to a Nightingale or Autumn or Ode to a Grecian Urn, that whole idea of beauty and joy and truth to be found is all the more because I'm getting it from Fanny's perspective. So when I think about mortality or permanence, yes, I examine the way mortality or permanence is written about in any of the poems, whether it be, you know, when I have fears, or whether it be Ode to Autumn, which is very much a kind of acceptance of what cannot be changed with the seasons and life and time. But it's so much richer when I understand, when I'm looking at the screen and seeing this relationship with this woman he adored. He's got more reason to live, more reason to want to fight mortal existence. And it's that sort of thing that you've got to put into your writing. Sorry, I know I've rambled a bit there. Let me go a little bit further onto the next slide. I've got more of these opposites. You know, that Keats, as a romantic writer, was very much about understanding human life as being a complex thing. So it's not just one thing like dream or vision. It's dream or vision put up against reality. It's the ideal against the real, the mortal against the immortal. It's recognizing they understood these ambiguities or these complexities. Do you want to say any more to that?
I think what's really important is the way that Campion, as a 21st century filmmaker, picks up the imagery of the poetry and translates it through the cinematic medium. The beautiful scenes of nature, you know, the fields of bluebells, the fields of daffodils, the winnowing, you know, wind coming through Fanny's windows and the curtains, you know, sort of blowing back and forth.
So what you're saying there, Miss, is that she is understanding again and paying homage to
the beauty
Keats' of romantic beliefs.
Absolutely.
And that sense of romanticism is still alive in the conversation between Keats and Campion. So that's what you've got to do, not rave on like we are now.
But she's also representing, you know, this idea that our romantic notion, our love of nature, the way that nature informs and guides us into understanding our humanity and our purpose and the truth of our existence.
Now, what you've just given us there, Miss, is an example of evaluation, isn't it? You've analysed the poetry, and now you're coming to that evaluative statement that you give at the end.
Yes, and I'm saying as an artist, Campion has picked up all of those elements, of the lyrical elements of Keats's poetry, the way that he's done it through the metaphors and the extraordinary accumulation of images of nature in all its beauty and intensity and power, and she's translated it through the film medium. So that visually this film is a homage to Keats's poetry, without even making direct reference to the poetry, but it is a living homage to his poetry.
And in the same way as we said about Plath and Hughes, you've got to use those words like intertextuality. You've got to talk about repeated images, that the written image, the poetic images transform into cinematic images.
You probably also need to use the word appropriation.
In
what ways is the later artist appropriating elements of the art,
which very much applies to Hughes as well. That's what Hughes is doing, and it's for this new purpose. And the new purpose links to the new context. Now, guys, what's on the screen at the moment? I'm not going to read those notes out to you, but a lot of that was in the mid-year markers report. The post-trial markers report. Now, if you don't have a copy of that, please ask your teacher for it or write to me and I'll happily resend it, because what I did when I wrote that report was go back through some of the best essays for Keats' Bright Star and also for Plath and Hughes. And there are some sensational, I would say, evaluative statements and some really strong analysis of the two texts. So again, I'm not going to read these slides out to you, but look, again, I've got boring singular words here when I come to what are the ideas, what are the concerns between Plath and Hughes. I've got words like relationship with self and others, love, mental health, responsibility. Those words on their own are not ideas. You need to tease them out, and they need to be much more complex than that. So if we think about love in relation to Hughes and Plath, we're going to look at the fact that clearly love, very profound love. I think it was Miss Murphy said a moment ago that really the conversation between Hughes and Plath began the moment they came together as a couple. And that, so we could even look at the fact that in order in order to write the sort of poetry that Sylvia Plath wrote in the Ariel collection, it came out of having loved very deeply and very profoundly.
Deep,
and
intense, passionate response to
But then to feel that sense of, is it betrayal? Is it, what is it that she felt that
yes.
really, that took the love and then transformed that into something so much more complex? So maybe it goes back to that top point about relationship with myself. So Plath's relationship with herself, Plath's relationship with Hughes, and Plath's relationship, therefore, with her writing. All of that changed.
The way the image that she'd created of herself changed.
So again, guys, do you see that? We're not just talking about love. Love, if you do that, you're talking about a low C range response.
Too simplistic.
So if you're thinking about a word like that, think about it the way we just did it then. Same with
where
Keats.
you're exploring the intensity of the emotions and how those emotions changed from that intense love at the beginning of their marriage, and how it developed into what you termed as betrayal, anger. Yes, that could have resulted from insecurities. It doesn't matter where they came from, but that intensity of emotion that that love turned into.
And guys, I hope you're hearing, even from the three of us, that we've all got slightly different interpretations.
That's right.
And that's awesome. That's what we want from you, and that's what HSC markers do not want to be sitting there reading every student from St Francis Xavier's College writing exactly the same thing about the poetry, about Campion's film, about Keats's poetry. They want your interpretation, which, as long as you can justify it according to your analysis, it may be slightly different to other students in your class.
And that's the important thing too, isn't it? Being able to justify it, and that means you go back to that module once again, the textual conversation.
Yeah.
Can it be supported by what's in the text? Because it's the text that we're talking about. So, what we see with Plath and Hughes is that sort of personal story and that intimacy between their two texts. Whereas for Keats and Campion, where you lack the intimacy that they had, it translates as something else.
Yeah, for her it was this greater admiration for who he was and what he did, but it was also inspired by the silenced voice or the silenced experience of the female in that patriarchal world.
And how she wished to tell the story of that relationship from the perspective of the woman in the story who in the patriarchal world of Regency England was not given the right to have a voice, was not given, even considered to have enough intelligence to be able to learn about poetry, and which is something that she puts in the film, but we have no biographical information about.
No, and that's where the word reimagined in the rubric is vital, because all Campion could do was reimagine.
That's right.
Guys, that's evaluative, okay? Campion is showing an understanding of the limitations of Keats's writing and Keats's context. And that's one of the things she's trying to offer a new audience. A new audience isn't going to be satisfied with the singular male experience. No. They want that fully fleshed out male and female experience, which is why she's privileged the female. Gosh, we're clever, aren't we, ladies, this morning?
But her what she's done is an interpretation.
Yes.
And it's a reimagining. And it's going back to those words in the rubric.
Yeah.
If you go back to re-envisaging or reimagining or, that's when we're understanding. You keep going back to the rubric and keep looking at those words to understand what you're trying to prove.
Reimagine. Think of the way that she incorporates the poetry into the narrative of the film. How she has Keats and Fanny reciting Bright Star together.
Yeah.
We have no evidence of that. How they recite La Belle Dame sans Merci together.
Yes.
We have no evidence of any of that.
And
it's
what
totally
is she? And what is she?
I'm
sorry. A moment ago we were talking about context and how beliefs, values and attitudes shifted and changed. So that's a great example, to say it's because what she's doing there is emphasising the importance of equality, that we value the male voice and the female voice.
Suitable for her context.
Absolutely.
That's that post-feminist context, which of course is the perspective that she is bringing to the telling of the story through the
Now look,
poetry.
to go back to trusting yourself, and it's time to go back to your teachers. Any questions you've got, any information, if you've got holes or gaps in your notes, reach out to one another as well. We've helped each other this morning, and I'm hoping that you'll be also turning to one another. It's too hard to do this on your own, guys. So reach out to your teacher, reach out to your peer group, anyone, it doesn't matter whose class they're in. If they're doing the common text the same as you, reach out to them, and maybe they might have a slightly different perspective to the one that you have. And don't be bothered by that, be enriched by that. Work together and have confidence in your own voice, but please remember you need to come at this with complex statements, clear understandings, sharp understandings of the composer's contexts, their purpose, and then their actual text. Don't forget that you need to also have the meta language to analyse what they're saying, how they're saying it, and the impact they wanted to have on you as a reader or viewer or audience. Best of luck, Year 12, from all of us here.
Good luck.
Good luck.